Hello and welcome to this episode 5 of the Pebble Inspector Podcast. My name's James Gray. I am the Pebble Inspector in Chief, picking things up, having a look, and putting them back down again. And by that I mean writing things. This is my weekly digest of my writing experience, in particular as part of the last few weeks and months of my master's degree in creative writing and literature studies at Lancaster University. And I'm in the last few weeks of writing my dissertation now, and so for the past few weeks and the last few episodes I've been taking a look at the pieces that I've written for that. This week is a little bit different. You may notice the audio is slightly different. I'm actually away on holiday at the moment, so I'm not under a duvet. I'm sat in a kitchen, so it might be a bit echoey. Sorry about that. I'll do my best to clean it up. And this episode is going to be a little bit different as well. I'm going to, rather than talk about what I've been writing, I'll talk about some of the books and texts that I've been reading during my master's. So these are all titles that I have read either by reading lists provided by the course, or that I've happened to come across, or that I've read previously and returned to because I think they may be of use. It's quite a long list, so I'll rattle through it. It's a bit of an experiment. We'll see how it goes. Yeah, strap in. Thank you to those, if there is anyone who's listened to the previous episodes. This is essentially a journal of my writing. We're encouraged to create a journal or to record our writing experience. We have to, as part of our dissertation, we have to submit what's called a critical reflection, usually looking at one or two issues or considerations within your writing that you have had to think about or overcome or what have you, and to write about it. It's got to be a objective view of your writing as opposed to, oh, I really enjoyed writing this piece or anything like that. It's almost more like it is a more academic bit of writing, citing references and appropriate quotes and what have you from other writers that explain why you have done what you have done, or where others have done similar or not done similar, but you've made a decision. So this is essentially that. So I'm away on holiday at the moment. I was hoping to get a couple of days writing in, but I haven't done so far. I've snatched a couple of hours to record this because I'm trying to stick to the weekly schedule, and I pre-recorded all the previous ones, so I felt like I was in good stead, but they run out quickly, it turns out. So today is Wednesday, so I should have time to record this, edit it, and get it ready to go out on Friday as usual. I think it's good to try and keep to some kind of schedule even if I'm away. I've only got 3 weeks or so when I get back to finish my dissertation and write my critical reflection. It's not a lot of time, but I have had a couple of days good writing before I came away, which I will speak on in other episodes. I'll look at those bits of writing. The last episode, I looked at the piece of writing based on the farm, and I only had about 600 words, and I don't know if it's to do with recording that episode or whether it was just coincidence, but since recording that episode, that piece has quadrupled in size. I had a really good day or so of mining memories, or just mining thoughts on it and having time to think about it and just putting words on the screen. And I'm pleased with the way it's coming out. I'll do an episode on it in full, but yeah, it's been an interesting process to see it come together, and I'm hopeful that part of that was a direct consequence of recording the episode. So that's good. On to today's episode. As I say, it's going to be a run through of the titles that I've been reading during this degree. They're in no particular order. Some of them are bunched together just because that's how I thought of them. Some of them are from a reading list that we were given, and some are some that I found, as I say. I'll explain roughly for each which one it is. I just had a look, there's about 39, 40 titles here, so it's a lot to get through, so I'm not going to do a deep dive, and I've talked about some of them elsewhere. And whenever I do talk about titles, I do put the author and the title of the piece in the description, and if you're on my website, that should be a clickable link. We'll crack on, because I think it's going to take a while to get through these, and I don't know how long I've got before I lose the kitchen again, so let's get on with it. Number one, The Tent by Margret Atwood. Really strange little book. I don't know how I came across it. It was one of my, I call them kind of found texts. It wasn't a given title for the course. I don't know where I found it. I picked it up because it was Margret Atwood and it was a slim volume and the blurb sounded cool. It's a collection of writing and they're kind of essays, but they're kind of not. They're kind of mad. It's illustrated with her own, I think they're woodcuts. And they're little bits of advice, I think, and they're little bits of almost kind of they're like little fables. They have little stories, little messages behind them, but they're told in really strange ways, and each one is just completely and wildly different. And they all have nearly all have a little message behind them. I rattled through it, just had it by the bedside and read it just before going to sleep each night. And yeah, really odd. What I would say is if you were a new author and you had this exact same collection of text and you took it to a publisher, it would not get published. This was published because it's Atwood, obviously, and because it's Atwood, we trust what she's saying. It doesn't mean it's not good. It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that certain perhaps experimental or unusual stuff, or even just things that don't fit in a neat box, you have to have that weight behind you before they will reach the public. But anyway, I think it was a really interesting one. I didn't feel like, I don't know what I took away from it directly, but I felt like by reading it, it sparked just this idea of creative writing for creativity's sake. It's not, I'm setting out to write a short story or I'm setting out to write an essay. It's words on the screen, words on the page, to see where they go, very sort of trans genre and form, almost poetry in places, almost essay. I picked up on that very much so, and it felt like a little spoonful of sugar with medicine going down sweet that helped unlock something in my writing, a freedom, an idea of formlessness or softening of boundaries between form that I thought was really valuable. So I spoke about that for longer than I anticipated. The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry. I was aware of Kevin Barry, but I'd never actually read any of his work. And again, I think I picked this one up just because it was like I was getting some books off World of Books for the course, and this came up as recommended. So sod it, and it goes. Really, really, really good. It's a short, it's a novella into a short novel, I guess. I can't remember how many pages, not that long. It's written in this really loose and wild way that Kevin Barry seems to do, where it's a third person perspective, but the third person has embodiments of its protagonist. So it's almost like the protagonist is narrating their own life in third person. It felt like that almost. Really cool vernacular. It's set in the 1890s in the West, in America, in Butte, Montana. Irish immigrant. He's a drunk, he's a wastrel, but he's like a poetic heart. He's fallen in love with the idea of running away before he's even done it. And this kind of romantic elopement, and it's just this fairly madcap, I don't know, it could be formulaic, and maybe it is formulaic, but the writing is of such high quality and the embodiment of that voice is so good that I don't mind it. I was reading a couple of reviews of saying it's a little bit shallow, the characters weren't fully realised, they're kind of really limited to just their dialogue and what have you. I kind of agree with that, but it's a short enough book that I didn't mind. It felt like I just inhabited that world for a little bit and I enjoyed it, and then we're back out of it. I think that the dialogue and the narration of it is of high enough quality to sustain it, even if the story and the characterization isn't maybe as great as we could have it, but great. Moving on, The Years by Annie Ernaux. I've spoken about this previously in its influence on the piece of writing I was doing about sort of an encyclopedia of my life. Snippets and vignettes and little snapshots of a personal history taken through seemingly quite random prompts like adverts and TV shows and presidential elections and things in France, taking us from the 1940s up to the early 2000s. Yeah, really interesting way of doing it. I listened to it as an audiobook, which was really well narrated. Like I said, I've spoken about it before, but I was recommended this one by my dissertation supervisor because he recognised the kind of fragmentary nature of my work, I guess, and it was a spot-on recommendation. I don't think I would have come across it otherwise, so yeah, good. Similarly, The Truth About Babies by Ian Sansom. And it was an A to Z. I spoke about it again in that previous episode, which I think is called A is for Angst. And yeah, just fragmentary, using the A to Z as a format to prompt these seemingly quite disparate entries. It sounds like a parenting book, and I guess it is a parenting book. Would a non-parent get something out of it? Yeah, for sure, I think, because it gives insight into what maybe their parents have been through, or just a life experience that a lot of people go through, even if the reader hasn't themselves. But I think probably, yeah, it's more inevitably more relevant if you're a parent, I guess. But yeah, it's cool. It was a nice, unusual book. Another spot-on recommendation. Next up is A Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius by Dave Eggers, which again I've spoke about in a previous episode, I think, Bleak Midwinter. It's a autobiography of sorts, but takes great license with the form, breaks down the kind of fourth wall, whatever you'd call it, the narration, plays around with not with the truth maybe, but with the accuracy of things, and maybe what gets priority is the telling over the accuracy. He diverges and interweaves and makes all sorts of weird tangents, and then he comments upon his own writing, and it's very, very fluid, very unusual. I've only ever read one of the Dave Eggers book just before starting the course, which was the book of short stories or something, which are like 1 or 2 page short stories, which is really good. Again, a bit like the Tent. It's like a little bit of medicine just to help with your own writing. You know, just dip into that, and it's just going to spark something. That was a recommendation from Joel Golby podcast. So Joel Golby, who wrote 4 Stars, which I mentioned again in a previous episode, he has a podcast called the Joel Golby Book Club, and he mentions that book in there. So that was a good one. But Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius, it seemed like quite a big book, and I was worried whether I should be reading it at this time during my dissertation because I have so much to do. But I read it quite quickly. The style is just very accessible, quite conversational almost, but then it by turns very sort of creative and expressive, and takes language. He takes that language of the 90s. I'll talk about, there's another book, Hey Nostradamus, later in this list. That a certain time in the 90s where it felt like writers were once again trying to break free of something, and it felt very much of a time, and into the early 2000s, and tech startups and new media in San Francisco, which makes it sound kind of wanky, but it's not. It's really good, and he has this whole other appendix that he writes afterwards, which is basically, I think it's called something like Mistakes That We Knew We Were Making, and he addresses all the inaccuracies in the book and explains why he does them. And I spoke about this in one of the earlier episodes about how he talks about how writing about your own life can seem narcissistic, but actually if your life isn't worth writing about, then it's probably not worth living. And I don't know, it helped me be more confident in my writing of my own life, so that was good. Next up is 2 books by Raymond Carver. There's a third Raymond Carver later in this list, but it's different enough to deserve a separate entry. So Shortcuts is a collection of short stories, and Will You Please Be Quiet is another one. So I believe Shortcuts was actually made into a film in the 90s. I've not seen it. Raymond Carver is a name that I had on my radar without ever reading. I just knew he was a short story writer, and that I kind of got him and what's the other guy? The guy who writes like crime noir type fiction, Raymond Chandler. It mixed up in my head, but I kind of thought there were probably people I'd like to read, but I'd never read them. And then I came across this other title that's further down in the list first, and then went back and read his short stories. Just really well crafted short stories. There's a story behind him that he basically had no success well into his 30s. He was basically kind of an alcoholic, unhappy marriage, whatever. Got out of that and started writing and got published and had this whole other life for the sort of last 20 years of his life. And he had an editor who almost rewrote his work, and it's kind of this famous relationship of, is it even his work by the end of it, because it was so changed. But I think the resulting stories are, they're so good, they're so tight, there's so many images and lines that stick with you, so simply told. And I guess it's always that kind of writing that I've always been aiming for. But it's probably because I'm so heavily influenced by 20th century male American writers, from Hemingway to Cormac McCarthy and Steinbeck stories, these kind of tight prose, super sparing. And I guess that style is maybe a little bit out of fashion, maybe because it's been overdone, but I'm clearly kind of pretty heavily influenced by it. But yeah, Raymond Carver's stories, again, just short little things you can pick up, read a story before you go to sleep, or just as a break from when writing's not coming as easily as you'd hoped. And as a result, you'll just feel like, shit, that's how you do it. You know, that's like, he's taken this thing, he's made something happen, he's described it, and he's left you with it, and you're just kind of left with these images. Really good. This is another just found text. I got it in a charity shop. Thomas Kinsella, Selected Poems. Thomas Kinsella he was an Irish poet, Dublin poet. Again, I think I was vaguely aware of his name, maybe through Blind Boy, I guess. I hadn't read any of his poetry before, but yeah, just beautiful words put in an order that is very pleasing to the ear. I've been stumbling into poetry a little bit during my course, and I guess I did previously, but I'm not a poet. I'm not trained in poetry. I haven't done the undergraduate courses on poetry. I haven't had any, so I'm kind of this like untutored, don't know what I'm doing. And at times I think that's a good thing, because it just gives me the freedom to write whatever I feel like writing without worrying about what form it is. But equally, I feel like bull in a china shop. You know, there's so much great poetry out there, and then I just stumble in thinking I can do it. It kind of seems a bit arrogant, but it doesn't come from a place of arrogance. It comes from, I guess you'd call it, curiosity about how you can write in a way that paints a picture or a sketch with as fewer words, or perhaps as straight. I don't know, a way of doing it that's different. I'll read you a piece of his poetry. Sorry, to go back. I've mentioned other books. Obviously, this one is a very long one a list of books, but in each of the episodes I've mentioned books, and I've given a little kind of insight into why I think it has been useful. Those texts have been useful, but what I think I haven't done and I should be doing in future is reading from them, because it's all very well me saying, this is a great book and it's been really useful, but you may not have read that book, or why are you going to read that book just because I say that? And maybe you don't need to read it, maybe you don't want to, that's fine. But I think maybe I should be doing some readings from them. So I'm going to try and do more of that. And this is the first one, I guess. So this is a poem called Dream by Thomas Kinsella. Picture a stony desert, baked and still. A creature scuffles among the rocks and stops, harrying its own vitals. Another figure stands still on one foot, pulling its head down between its shoulders, torn by a great extinct beak. Other shapes are lying here and there in the dust. A group of human figures makes an appearance, some seemingly at home in the pitiless waste. One of their number is smiling all around him, with another bolder than the rest. He approaches the first two creatures, misjudging their apparent preoccupation. He is caught by the first and swallowed in an instant. His companion is seized by the second as a support. The others squat on their heels, watching and waiting, opening their throats and wailing with low voices. The scene darkens. So it carries on. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Just really good. I don't know what to. I'm not a poetry critic, but I really enjoyed that collection, and I kept going back to it. Just again, I keep saying this, so just pick it up as like a little. It's like a breath mint after dinner. It's like washing your hands and face for no other reason other than to reset the day. It's brilliant. I love it. You know, you're out on a walk and you see a little tumbling stream. You think, fuck it, I'm going to wash my face. Why do you need to wash your face? I don't know, but you're sweaty and you're dusty and you feel amazing afterwards. And it's the same with some of these. Just pick them up. You read a Thomas Kinsella poem and you just get on with your day thinking, fuck, I feel better. I don't know. Right, moving on. Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. I talked about that in, I think, the second episode. I can't remember. Max Porter, it's an account of a widowed father, and grief is made real into a giant crow. I think it's a giant one anyway. I imagine it in my head to be giant crow that comes to live with them. And it talks in this weird crow click-clack language. And it's a very tumbling and confusing and really beautiful story that is just really strange and felt very experimental when I read it. It was another recommendation by my supervisor. And yeah, reassuring that this stuff gets published, I think. I think Max Porter maybe worked in the publishing industry initially and so kind of primed the publisher to receive it. But I think he's a poet as well, and that really comes through. A short book, I read it in one sitting, made me cry. Really good, really enjoyable. I've spoken about it in one of the previous episodes, so I won't spend too long on it. Moving on, we have Ant Colony by Michael Deforge. So this is a departure from the rest of these. It's actually a graphic novel, which I came across because I had an idea for a piece for my dissertation, which didn't survive contact. I'm still interested to write it, but it's not here. A piece of work that was from a collective consciousness, using that we plural. And I was looking for examples of people who've done that before. There's quite a few out there. There's ones about bee colonies. There's lots of human ones as well. There's lots of other examples of it. But Ant Colony came up as a suggestion, or when I was Googling around. And I'm always, when somebody says, oh, I don't even like graphic novels, but this one was really good. That's not a good recommendation, because if you don't like graphic novels, you're not very discerning and you don't know what's a good and a bad one. You know, when someone says like, I don't even like poetry, but I like this poem, it's like, right, so like, why does everyone's entitled to their opinion, but am I going to trust yours more than somebody who's like really into poetry and they say this is a good poem? It seems an odd thing to qualify the statement with. But I will say I'm not a big reader of graphic novels. It's not that I'm against them. I'm not snooty about them. I'm not snobbish around them. I just don't read them very often. Anyway, I got a hold of this one and it's really good. The artwork is fantastic. It's so weird. It's set in an ant colony, but they're very human, and it's just really strange. Again, read it in one sitting, and it was like, oh, that's another way of telling a story, and look how they've done that. Yes, there is a visual element, and would it work without the visual? Maybe not, because otherwise why would it be a graphic novel? But I think it wouldn't take many steps for it to work without the visual. Really interesting. I really enjoyed that one. It's really expensive. Mostly you have to buy it from America or Canada, but I managed to find a copy of it on Vinted for like £6 instead of, £25 or something with loads of postage. So yeah, get out, have a look on Vinted. Next up is A Shock by Keith Ridgway. This was another collection of short stories. This one was recommended by Blind Boy, whose podcast I listen to and who appears actually in this list. I think possibly he recommended A Heart in Winter. I'm not sure. He certainly talks about Kevin Barry quite a bit. So A Shock, short stories are all set in London, but Ridgway's an Irish author, I think. And so the stories, not completely, but they have an element of maybe that Irish diaspora experience in London without it being rammed down your throat. In fact, it's never really referred to particularly. It's just there if you want it to be, I guess. Yeah, really nice collection of stories. I wouldn't say I 100% got on board with all of them, but I definitely enjoyed reading it. There were some brave choices in how he represented sex and relationships or non-relationships or encounters. There was weirdness, but not too much. I'll talk about some other weird stories later on in this list. There was weirdness, but it was used so sparingly that the weirdness was preserved. If you overdo it, it becomes blasé, and his wasn't. It wasn't like magical realism or anything like that, although the scenario that was described is pretty weird. But yeah, I really enjoyed reading it. I thought his voice was really nice, really clear and just confident, and you felt like you would follow him. You would follow his writing wherever he decided to take it, I guess. So that was good. Next up is quite a good kind of comparison. Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. So this was a recommended text from the short story module. So it's another collection of short stories. I think perhaps Armfield's first. These were weird short stories. So they all had a weird twist. And I like a little bit of weird. Obviously, I've got inflatable skeletons in some of my writing, and I've got giant unkillable turkeys, and I've written other stuff that has weirdness within it. I like the absurd particularly. But I will say, I think I haven't read all the stories, I should also say, in this collection. And I think if you were to read it all in one go, this repeated and then this weird thing happened would just be too much, and it would lose its power. Like I say, with Ridgway and A Shock, there is there's this very strange thing, but it hardly features at all, but it's so strange that it carries more power. Whereas Salt Slow, it's always kind of like a reveal, haha, isn't that weird? But they're good and they're short, so you go with it. But I would say you dip in and you dip out, and you maybe read one every few weeks or something, so that you kind of forget. Otherwise, I think it gets a little bit repetitive, maybe. Not that I could ever write anything as good as that. Here's me. It's like, that kind of, there's a big couch potato with like a bowl of crisps on it, on his belly, watching the Olympics or something. It's like, you fucking idiot. Anyway, that's me reading these books. Like, I should have done that. And actually, I'm a fucking idiot. Another one is called West, A Journey Through the Landscapes of Loss by Jim Perrin. This was another, what I would call like maybe found book, in that I just saw it in secondhand bookshop or in charity shop. I know of Jim Perrin. He writes in climbing media quite a lot. He also had a regular column in The Guardian as the sort of countryside diarist. He's a nature writer, and he comes from a background of the 60s, 70s, 80s climbing scene in North Wales. He's very florid and out there with his language, but this is a memoir through a series of essays of he lost his son to suicide, and then 9 months later lost his partner to cancer, and the news of the cancer diagnosis came something like 2 weeks after the death of his son, or the funeral of his son. And it is just unrelentingly devastating. I cried a lot reading it. I was writing a lot about grief in my personal essay module, which is when I was reading this. And so it helped take some of the squeamishness away from talking about it. He strips away any kind of squeamishness. This isn't a perfect book at all, and he's very literary, and he peppers his work with references and quotes and allusions and name dropping of authors and writers and stories, which is fine. That's what he is. He has been a lecturer. He is an academic, so fair enough. He's entitled to that, but it feels a little heavy-handed at times. And he talks about sex in a very frank way. He does so in context, I would say, but there is a little bit of like shying away. It's like watching a sex scene with your parents on TV when you're a kid. It was a bit like, and he's an older guy, which again shouldn't be a problem, but he's an older guy, and he's really graphic descriptions of stuff. You're like, okay, I don't necessarily need that. But what it is him writing completely and without any kind of inhibition, because that is his complete experience of his relationship with his partner, and that is as much part of it as her cancer diagnosis and holidays and the other sides of their love. So that is interesting. I went into a rabbit hole the other day because as I was preparing for this episode, I was just kind of looking through some of the refreshing my mind on some of the titles. I was looking at, there was a Guardian review of the book, and he used to be the Guardian country diarist. And I was just, for whatever, you should never look at the comments, anything really, on anything. You should never look at the comments, but I did. And there was this whole spat in the comments, but some of them were deleted and redacted, some were, and then the responses were alluding to the ones that had been deleted, so it's kind of like half there, half not. And he was talking about name calling and inaccuracies and all sorts. So it's really weird. And then some of the commentators were, their like username was connected to the name of his partner who died. I went to a wormhole, so they've created a blog which is basically refuting all the stuff he said. In the book, he kind of talks about her family a little bit in not a great light. I don't know. I don't know anything about it other than this rabbit hole I went down. But it does introduce an interesting question about life writing, which obviously we should be aware of, and we do have ethics seminars during the course. Is the ethics of the writing. So yes, his son has died and his partner had died, but his partner has family who are still living. He's still alive. His son has friends and family. And so the obligation of an author when writing about the deceased, to not only to the deceased, but also to the living, I just thought was kind of an interesting thing. But the book itself, I think it's probably like a 75% perfect book, good book. Writing about landscape and writing about the natural world, he's very, very strong. Writing about climbing and the climbing experience is very strong. So I took a lot from that. Next up, we have another Raymond Carver. This one is A New Path to the Waterfall, which is the first book of Raymond Carver's that I had in my hands. This is another found book that I picked up from the village I live in. Has a bus stop where they have secondhand books in it, just on a book swap type thing. And again, I recognised the name, so I picked it up. And it's a collection of his poetry, and I didn't know he was a poet. I just thought he was a short story author. In fact, I thought he was a crime noir fiction writer, so I was completely wrong. And he was diagnosed with lung cancer, and in the last few months of his life, whatever it was, he collected that poetry together with his partner, and then also quotes from favoured authors, particularly Chekhov. He was, again, I found all this out as I was reading this, that he was described as America's Chekhov, writing these almost perfect short stories. And they presented the Chekhov quotes almost as poetry themselves. They slightly altered the line breaks and stuff. It was more his writing that I was interested in. And I actually ended up using this title, this work, as something to hang one of my pieces of writing on in the personal essay module. So he used literature and his own writing as a way of facing this diagnosis. And I picked up the book just as my mum was diagnosed with lung cancer, but I didn't read it in that time. I sort of felt like I couldn't. And so I only picked it up, a couple of years after she died. But the poetry was just really spoke to me, I guess. And so I then wrote an essay that was kind of centered around that. Who knows, maybe I'll do a reading of that at some point. So a really unusual book. Again, this is an example a bit like The Tent of a book that would only get published if you're already established. Nobody's going to I don't think anyone's going to publish this collection of quotes and poetry and reflections on death, even if it is as good as it is if you are unknown. Moving on, In Another Country by David Constantine. This was a collection that we read a couple of stories from, a story from, for the short story module. Never read any Constantine before. Just good writing. I read a couple more from the collection. I bought, rather than just reading the one text, I bought the collection. Just craft, just really good craft of taking something, an event, a happening, an observation, and progressing it. I think that's what I'm always driving towards, because I think it's something I don't do as well myself, is progressing. Things happen, and they happen, and then it finishes, rather than just lingering on things. Very instructive in that respect. Yeah, good. Next up is The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien, which I had read previously when I was much younger. This I ended up coming back to for a piece of writing for one of the other modules, which was a creative criticism module, which I think I talk about a few of the titles from later on. It's described as perhaps the world's first postmodern novels. Flann O'Brien, he had various pen names, Miles Nagopoline and Brother Barabbas and various others. Brother Barnabas. Barnaby? Whatever. He was in similar time to Beckett and Joyce, great modernist authors, and he was a modernist author. He never quite got the renown that he deserved in his lifetime, and then since has been recognised, which is kind of a tragedy. Whereas the other two, Beckett and Joyce, had great success in their lifetimes and have gone on to be lauded as, almost gods. So The Third Policeman was his second novel, I think. He wrote, his first novel was At Swim Two Birds, which is massive and dense and not Finnegan's Wake-esque, but not far off Ulysses type. Anyway, that actually did do well. Publisher asked for a second book, so he's had this idea to go even wilder, and he wrote Third Policeman. You've got it's books within books and characters with self-awareness, and you've got policemen turning into bicycles because of their prolonged contact with a bike and the exchange of particles. Really, really mad stuff. Funny, dark, weird. It's not that long, 250, 300 pages, if that. And the publisher refused to publish. They said it was too mad. And they refused to publish it, and it was published after his death. He wrote other books in that time, but that was the book that could have launched him into, like I say, it's the first post-modern book. So you had the modernism of Joyce's Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake and Beckett's plays and his own novels. And you have this novel that wasn't published in his lifetime. That I think it's a real shame. He was a journalist. He worked for the Irish Times, I think, and he stayed in Dublin. Whereas Beckett and Joyce moved to Paris and kind of lived that kind of literary life. Whereas he just he was pretty successful. He was a civil servant and a writer, and he drank in the bars of Dublin and died an alcoholic. Beckett said he could never have stayed in Dublin because he would have just spent all his time in the pub, and I think perhaps Flann O'Brien was proof of that. Next up, we have The Power by Naomi Alderman, which I was aware of because it was adapted for radio maybe, and maybe won awards, I think. I used to I had 2 spells working in different Waterstones stores many years ago, and so I have a lot of books that I'm aware of because I've like stocked them on shelves or sold them to people, but I've never actually read. I think this was maybe one of them, and I think I picked up a copy of it from the book swap place in the village, but just never got around to reading it. And this was one of the titles on the reading list for another module that I did, which was called Sacred Imaginations, which was the role of the sacred and the apocalyptic and the utopian and religion in general in 20th and 21st century literature. I enjoyed it a reasonable amount. I listened to it mostly on audiobook at the time during the course because I've been trying to cram it all in, and I've been trying to renovate the house and stuff, or walk the dog, or go out with our toddler and stuff. If she falls asleep in the carrier, if I'm out walking the dog, or if I'm plasterboarding a ceiling, I'll stick an audiobook on, and then I find where I am in the physical book when I come back to the book. So I've done that with a few of them, and it's told in it's a imagined future history fiction. So it's told through historical fragments of writing and audio recordings and stuff. So it worked quite well on audio, but you're always reliant on the quality of the readers, and that was okay. I think they were okay. So I like that concept. I thought it took a concept being that women somehow become able to create electric charge that can kill people, and various other kind of powers, the power that then can be transmitted or passed on from woman to woman. Some women have it naturally, it comes about in a few women and they pass it along and it spreads throughout the earth. And this imagined future is where it's so far in the future that our time and earlier times are so distant that it's very fragmentary. And I think it showing the nature of history and our understanding of history and how fragmentary it is, and how we create narratives from it that we start to believe are accurate, but they're based on incomplete evidence. And so it takes the form in part of it of emails or letters between two academics, a male and a female. And the dynamic is very much that the male would take on what would be the kind of stereotypical position of what perhaps a female academic maybe takes, of he's condescended to and he's patronised and he's not taken seriously, whereas his female colleague and friend is the one with all the power, because in this far imagined future it's a complete reversal of perhaps some of those gender norms that we see today. So the concept of the book revolves around that, and I enjoyed it, but it really relied on that one thing a lot, and I maybe wanted a little bit more from it. I don't need a lot of plot in my reading. I prefer a more lyrical position of writing. I don't know how to describe it, but I felt like it'd be a good TV series, Handmaid's Tale-esque, which obviously takes a lot from, and the two are put together quite commonly and clearly, and I think they occupy a similar space, but I felt like it needed something else, either an extra complexity or strip it back a little bit more and let's just have a more beautiful evocation of that world. I don't know. I used to read quite a bit of fantasy, and this kind of felt like a fantasy novel, which I suppose it is in a way, although it's not a genre novel. And it felt a bit too much like that, by which I mean you're reliant on the mechanics and the lore and the world building more than you're reliant on the writing itself. Again, this is me as like a fat slob watching the Olympics, calling a high jumper a fucking idiot. Naomi Alderman is a very good writer, and it was and also the epistolary kind of style of it, of like making it up from fragments of letters and artifacts, really went on to very directly influencing my submission for that module. So absolutely can't take away from that. Which leads on to another one from that same reading list, that same module, was The Testaments by Margret Atwood, which is a prequel, should say, to Handmaid's Tale. I preferred Atwood's writing to Alderman's, but even though in a way they kind of do the same thing, I think I enjoyed it, but I still find plot can get in the way a little bit. Is that stupid? I think it probably is stupid, isn't it? But that's just how I feel about it. Sometimes when the plot is, there's a lot to get in there, then it's sometimes at the cost of just spending time with things. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I'm the Pebble Inspector as opposed to the Pebble Thrower. I don't know, whatever that means. God knows. Moving on from the same module. In fact, these are all bunched together in this same Sacred Imaginations module, which was, I think, had the heaviest reading list, as in the most reading by volume. The other one being the Creative Critical module was pretty heavy on the reading, but I think Sacred Imaginations pips it. Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin. Never read any Baldwin before. Yeah, really good. Pretty devastating. I think he has a reputation for that. But as a portrait of a particular time, but not just a time of an experience of the Black American experience in early 20th century. Just really good. Very lyrical. It's presented as fiction, but it's based really heavily on his life, I believe. Really powerful. This idea of personal religion and personal faith, as opposed to kind of doctrine, is really interesting and a really rich theme for his writing. I much preferred this to those previous two, even though the previous two were more modern in their presentation. And sometimes with James Baldwin, it was pretty unrelenting in its misery. That's not true, but there's beautiful stuff in there as well. But yeah, it was hard reading, but really masterful, really good. So that was that one. Next up, Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, which is much more modern novel in that it was written recently, but written in the style and set in the late 19th century. This is one of the titles that I ended up, the final submission we had to do was to take at least one of the titles and another either from the reading list or your own, and then write 4,000 or 5,000 words about it, or do something with it, whether it was looking at a particular concept within those titles or something different. So this was one of the titles I did. I enjoyed it. I listened to it and read it hybrid again. And again, it's told through letters and traditional narration and mixture of things. I enjoyed a lot of the imagery, really beautiful writing. Characters were really nicely realised. I listened to a couple of interviews with Sarah Perry. It's interesting. She was kind of brought up on, not brought up, she was, although I will come back to being brought up on stuff, she was called out in these interviews and the kind of Radio 4 book club where readers ask questions about how realistic was it that somebody would do such a thing in the book. And she said, well, they had to for the plot. And she was very honest. She said, these people exist to progress the plot. They are plot devices. And I don't know I've never heard an author say that before. And I think it's true. I think it's an honest reflection for a lot of people. But it was really interesting for her to hear her say, well, yeah, otherwise the story wouldn't happen. I thought it was really refreshing. I enjoyed the book. I thought it was good fun. I really enjoyed the concept. I think there was a lot of really nice writing in there. So she talks about how she was brought up in quite an unusual way. She didn't really have television. She didn't have television or anything as a child. They just read books, and she was obsessed with Victorian Gothic, basically. She wanted to write, or she ended up writing a Victorian Gothic novel. And they're not the kind of novels that I would read normally. But the way she breaks it down into this slightly more kind of epistory style means that you do rattle through it a bit easier, but it's not the kind of book I would have picked up if it wasn't for the course. So top marks for that. So the next one is a book that I used as a companion to the Essex Serpent in the piece that I wrote, but it wasn't on the reading list. I'd read it years previously. It's called A Maggot by John Fowles. Very, very strange book. I don't think it's even a particularly good book, but it's very strange. And both the Essex Serpent and A Maggot involve possible supernatural or possible creature involvement. I mean, in fact, A Maggot even has potentially extraterrestrial elements. So very strange. They're set 150 years apart. So A Maggot's set in 17-something or others. But there was really strong themes around Quakerism, Shakerism, which were themes that we'd talked about in the course, and about apocalyptic thinking or millenarian thinking, so thinking that the end times or the next coming of Christ is coming, and therefore we should concentrate on that rather than living in the day-to-day. So I tied the two together into my own piece, which again I might talk about if I run out of stuff to talk about on another episode. So yeah, like I said, I've read it's not a particularly good book. It's good if you, I don't know, it's worth reading, but he has others like The Magus and The French Lieutenant's Wife and stuff, which I think are probably more worthwhile. I think A Maggot was just written for his own enjoyment, and again, it's probably a book that would never get published if you weren't already John Fowles. I think it's fair to say that. But there we are, it's in there. Next up is another book from the same Sacred Imaginations module, Paradise by Toni Morrison. Yeah, really enjoyed this. It's set in an all-black community in North America through the 20th century, how it was founded, and then as it kind of continues to try and exist under the pressures and forces of a changing world. And yeah, just really nicely realised, written from different perspectives. It's got there is a nice bit of narrative running through it that it keeps returning to, but actually just paints a really good picture of this community. Really, really nicely done. I struggled a little bit to follow it, and I don't think that's the book's fault. I think because I was doing, again, hybrid of reading and listening, keeping hold of some of the voices that were talking at different times, as in within the book, and told from different perspectives, I did struggle with a little bit. But also the way it's told from this kind of a memory, or a collective memory, or remembering, you do get this kind of voices over inaccurate remembering. So it is a little bit unclear intentionally, but that didn't necessarily help my reading of it. But the writing itself was really good. Yeah, super good. Next up, again, Sacred Imaginations, Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. Interesting that the title of that, Gilead, is obviously the fictional state in Handmaid's Tale and Testaments, but completely different story. I really enjoyed this. It's another epistolary novel. It's written as one long letter from a pastor, an elderly pastor before he dies, to his young son. And again, it paints a portrait of a community, a way of life in North America in a certain time, and presenting religion, different types of religion or interpretations of religion. He comes from a family of pastors and preachers, and you have the firebrand grandfather, and then the father who disappears off, and then he talks about the Civil War and how communities create or curate their own history, which is very similar to how Paradise operates. Beautifully written. Yeah, I've read one of the Robinson book before, I think. No, I thought I had. So there's Gilead, and then there's Home, and some others. I thought the one about the bombing of Guernica. I thought Guernica was by Marilyn Robinson. It's not. So I read the whole thing and think, oh yeah, I like Robinson's writing. Completely different author. I can't remember who wrote Guernica, but it's a good book as well. Next up, another one from the same module is Hey Nostradamus by Douglas Copeland. Very 90s account of a school shooting and what that then does to some of the people who are involved and their relationship with themselves and each other and God. It's a modern novel, and modern as in 90s novel, and it very much has that feel to it, but it also makes it nice and easy to read. It's told from different perspectives, so it breaks down nicely. I don't feel like I got as clear a picture of the religious element from it, even though there are religious elements present within the story, as I did with other titles in that list. And I've never read any other books by him, but I think I probably will. I would. It fit quite nicely with that kind of Dave Eggers feel. Yeah, I don't feel like I took as much away from this. Maybe I rushed through it. Maybe I can't think. It didn't stick with me as much. But the way it tells the same event from different perspectives was very interesting, and then it follows those characters into the future. That was quite interesting, so I liked that. Home Fire by Camilla Shamsi, again another Sacred Imaginations title. A very modern book, talking about, involves really the war on terror, the experience of British Muslims and Muslims in America, actually, British Muslim academic moving to America. But when we talk about British Muslims, that amorphous mass that the press use, obviously it's an individual experience, and I think it does a really good job of showing that, because you have this brother and a sister and very different experiences of that catch-all title. I enjoyed this in that it described to me a world that I don't know, I guess, or elements that I don't know. But it probably goes into that list of books where the plot is getting in the way of just spending some time on the writing, I guess. I found it a little bit kind of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, and he said this, and she said this, and he said this. I would have liked to have just spent a little bit more time on the interiors of those characters, I guess, I think would be fair. So I didn't feel like I fully connected with the characters as a result, not because they were different. In fact, they were very familiar feeling, because they're just modern characters living in Britain, although it deals a lot with London, so it's not really a world that I know. But yeah, enjoyed, but I wouldn't say it stuck with me. So this is the only Camilla Shamsi I've read. Would I read more? I trust her to tell me the story, but I'd maybe hope for a little bit more internal introspection and a little bit more of that kind of, I don't know, I wanted more lyricism, I guess. Maybe that's just the style I like. Who knows? Moving on, so this is Fen by Daisy Johnson, which was one of the stories from this collection, was one that we read for short story module. This goes into a similar category as Salt Slow. And interesting, I think one or both authors are quoted on the covers of these books. Actually, interesting, there's quite a few. I'm pretty sure Kevin Barry has a quote from one of these. Like, it seems almost like I entered like a whirlpool of the same authors who aren't directly connected but all seem to cross-reference or seem to have a connection to each other or have written each other's recommendations and stuff. So I don't know, it's kind of interesting. But Fen, Daisy Johnson, I think Daisy Johnson did the master's course that I'm doing currently. Gives hope that there's a publishing future for alumni of the course, but I suppose you have to have a certain element of skill and quality to get there. Again, weird stories. I enjoyed them. I think I shouldn't have read them all in one go, as in, consecutively. I should have broken it up by dipping in and out. Same with Salt Slow. I think I have read all of these now. I think so they're all very, they've got strange elements. There's like a house that basically is alive and swallows somebody and absorbs somebody. You've got a house full of female vampires. All really kind of cool, interesting concepts. But it's one after the other. You're like, okay, that's weird, cool. But her writing is very good. This is a very wanky thing to say. The sentence level writing is very good. So you don't mind so much. But I definitely shouldn't have read them all in one go. But what I did find to be a little bit repetitive, as well as this kind of, isn't that weird, was, as the title suggests, Fen. They're all set in the fens of, Norfolk, wherever, around there. Which is a very odd and, again, wanky word, liminal space. So, which is fine. I think having a theme and something to hang your hat on or a location is grand. But there was a little bit of like, here's this weird thing happening. Here's this mad story. Isn't that weird? Great. You're writing it really well. Good. And then by the end, it's always like, and it's in the fens. It's a little bit like, I would have been happy to have read these stories without the fens being the recurring theme, I think. And perhaps that's unfair to Johnson's writing because maybe I'm not as familiar with the fens to know the power that they have. Maybe if somebody was doing the same writing about, my sort of more native moors or fells, I'd maybe feel a little bit more forgiving of it. But I don't know if that's the case. I just don't know whether I needed it. I just think that, tell the weird stories, I guess. I say that, and one of the other books, A Shock, the Keith Ridgway book, they're all set in London, but they're all interlinking. So there's a reason behind it. So maybe if she'd interlinked them, I don't know. They wouldn't really work like that. It just felt like a bit of I need something to wrap these all around, so I'm going to choose the location. I don't know, maybe that's justified. So, good. Do I need it to be about the fens? Probably not. Next up, Constellations by Sinead Gleeson. I spoke about this in one of the previous, I think perhaps the second episode. Just a really fantastic collection of essays. Gleeson writes in a very accessible way. It's unpretentious and it's clear, but it's really dense with necessary detail, and she builds a picture and she progresses that picture and story, and she brings in different threads without it feeling too forced. She talks about the church and about health and about being a woman and Ireland and the 90s and all these kind of different things that come into it without ever feeling like they're crowbarred or shoehorned in. So just really great piece of writing. Again, I should have done some reading from it, but there isn't time now. Next up, Topographica Hibernica by Blind Boy Boat Club, which I started reading before I started the course, but it's a collection of short stories and I finished reading them during the course because I was just feeling not very confident about the short story module. I think some of the selected stories didn't speak to me as well as I'd hoped, or I felt like I was missing something. And so I returned to an author, if not stories, that I wanted to kind of, I guess it's safe ground. I feel safe with him as a writer. I wanted to kind of, I don't know, I just returned to him because he writes weird stuff. He writes from a very strange perspective, but in quite common things, I suppose, some of it. And I listen to his podcast. He's a weekly podcast every Wednesday, the Blind Boy podcast. Yeah, I kind of trust him to tell me stuff. He's got 3 collections. This is the 3rd, the latest one. And I wanted to be reminded of how to write a strange story without it feeling like a big reveal at the end, without it where the strangeness is woven in, where the voice is strange. I love a strange voice in writing. I love rather than a normal voice telling me something strange, I like a strange voice. So I don't know. There was one of the Daisy Johnson stories, the vampire, female vampires, that has a lovely strange voice to it. I really enjoyed that. Anyway, so yeah, topographic Hibernico, Blind Boy. Blind Boy basically is responsible for me doing this course. He talks about creativity a lot and about embracing the cringe, and you've just got to put yourself out there. And I was listening to another podcast that he was on, and about how nobody's going to knock on your door and say, oh, do you want to write a book? You know, you've got to be out there to do it, and that necessarily involves doing stuff that people are going to see and be like, the fuck is he doing? Who does he think he is? You know, there's people who I know who, if they see that I'm making a podcast, in the nicest possible way, they're going to take the piss, and I've got to accept that, because if I don't do this, and if I don't quit my job and do a master's and at least try, then it's never going to happen. And even if it doesn't happen, then the worst thing that happens is failure, and I can go back to doing whatever I'm doing. And he taught me a lot of that. And yeah, I recommend you listen to his podcast. Next up is Rocker's Gloss by Mark Goodwin. I read this ages ago, years and years ago, as a collection of poetry from a very, very small publisher. I don't know how I found it, actually. Must have seen an advert somewhere. And I think he's a climber. They are kind of about climbing, but not all about climbing. The thing that I took away from it is not, I don't write about climbing or mountains or the stuff that I do as a hobby. Not yet, anyway, maybe I will. I think because I sort of did it as a job, I don't really want to do it as this yet. But anyway, what I took away from it and what I returned to it for was his use of form within poetry. It's very visual. It's very disruptive. I would say it's not always necessary what he's doing, but he does it because he can, and because that form is as much part of his writing as the words he chooses are. And I think that's perhaps a reflection of the climbing mind, of like the mapping out of holds and footholds and handholds and gear placements and where you might climb to next and the route that you're going to follow. It's called a topo in climbing, which is like a drawing or a photograph with the line drawn on of the line you're going to follow on the crag. And his poetry almost takes on that form of, this is the necessary information you need, and this is the line that you follow to reach it. And he draws that line through his poetry with those words. And the poetry is not all about climbing. I mean, it's got the word rock in his title, but it's pretty diverse. He also, like a lot of my writing, has had kind of natural real-world elements, you know, geological or geographical or physical. That comes from my background, I guess, in my education. But also, I just think it's a really beautiful thing. So I took quite a bit from his stuff. Next up is The Emigrants by W.G. Siebold. I don't know how you say that, Siebold. This was a text that we read for the Creative Criticism module. The module was called Fusions. I didn't know what to expect from that module. I didn't really know what it was. I signed up for it. And it turned out to be one of the most enjoyable and most instructive, and actually one of the most successful if we're just talking kind of marks. The Emigrant, yeah, interesting book. It's written as a autobiography, or perhaps biography of his family, I suppose, probably more accurate, through the 19th, 20th century, and then trying to go back and discovering some of those locations, and again told through photographs and snippets and things. But a lot of it's not true. It's experimenting with this idea of how far can you push the idea of a biography or autobiography. Does it have to even be true? But I really enjoyed the writing. I found it quite easy to read. It flowed. I shouldn't say flow. It's a terrible cliched word. It just came really easily. The writing is unforced and elegant and smooth and just reassuring and quite poetic and quite visual. I enjoyed it. So that's The Emigrants. A couple of these, actually, all these are from the same module, Fusions. Selected poems of Paul Celan. A very strange collection of poetry. I'd never read any Celan before. German, was he? German, living in France? Can't remember, something weird. Dealing with the Holocaust, a lot of it. Or the experience of being in that time, from that Europe in that time, a reckoning with it, a reckoning with that history. Very, very odd, very hard to understand, quite short, mostly, mercifully short poetry, but very, very odd indeed. And it took me a bit, but this was what was really instructive about the module. The tutor, I haven't named any of these people, I don't know why. He's called John Shad, and he's really good. You read the text, and the next week he just goes around the room and he says, say something about that. Doesn't matter what it is. Did you like it? You can say whether you hated it. You could say here's something interesting, here's a quote, this stuck with me, just say something interesting. And I was like, shit, I am so out of my depth. I don't come from this undergrad. I'm not a literature student. Fuck, what do I'm just the person who reads stuff, and like occasionally writes, what the hell am I doing here? It was one of the first modules I did. I was so out of my depth. And so I just, I'd say whatever fuck came into my head. And that is exactly what you should do, because you're reading this work. Like, why not? The author is not sat on the reader's shoulder to tell them whether they're right or wrong about their interpretation or experience of reading that book. And that is true across the board. So reading Sealand, I'm like, I don't know what the fuck's going on, but I like some of the words. That's valid. And it's breaking down that barrier of, I'm not clever enough to understand this. And sure, I could be cleverer and I could get more out of it. And the more time I spent with those pieces and then did reading around the references and stuff, then yeah, they do make sense. But actually, if you just take it on a word by word basis and do a little bit of almost like word association, one of the poems is Sand for the Urns. And even if you just take the title, you're talking about urns and ashes and death and burial and funeral, and think, well, he was writing this in post-Holocaust. How loaded is that word? What normally goes into urns, and instead you've just got sand, which is just this abundant material that means nothing. I don't know, it's like, just give yourself time to think about this shit and it comes through and it's good. Anyway, so I ended up really enjoying his poetry, and I've read quite a bit of it, and it also gave me confidence to be a little bit more experimental and perhaps concentrating a little bit more on the effect those words have, rather than trying to create a strict narrative in the poetry. Just here's a collection of these words that we've strung together that create a feeling, as opposed to a clearer picture. The picture is perhaps more individual to the reader. I don't know, whatever. Next up in the same module was Paris, a Poem by Hope Merlis. Another really strange modernist poem. Describes a transect of Paris, walking through Paris, I guess, in a time. I think it's from 1922, something like that. So post First World War. Lots of allusions to the First World War. Paints this picture in a very sort of abstract way. I enjoyed reading it. I think I had to let it wash over me, which is perhaps relevant to the next title as well. Just let it wash over you. I don't understand every single line, but as a whole, it comes together. Interestingly, I believe, reading up about it, this was like the only thing like this that she wrote, and then she completely abandoned it, that style of writing, and disavowed it, and took up more like fancy writing, I think. She became Catholic and just completely disassociated herself with the modernist movement. It's interesting. Next up is The Waves by Virginia Woolf, somebody who very much did not dissociate herself from the modernist movement. This is another one where you have to let it wash over you. It's told through a group of friends, but you're never completely sure who is talking. You can only vaguely figure it out based on who they're talking about. If they're talking about all other six, then it must be the seventh character. Except I think the seventh character never has a voice and is somebody who went away and died in the First World War, I think. A true modernist novel. In the writing of this, Virginia Woolf was talking about how she wanted to come away from a traditional novel and create this work that transcended that and became something else, which is what The Waves became. And it's this idea of you don't necessarily know exactly what's happening all the time, but you have to just go with it. And I think a lot of these books, a lot of the books I've got a lot out of, stories, are like that. I haven't read much of Virginia Woolf other than this, I don't think. Snippets of stuff, maybe. I can't remember. I found it... I was still working during this module, a lot of this module, and so I was trying to juggle working full-time and then going to the lectures and then doing the reading, plus life. And so I struggled to get through The Waves, and I found I kept falling asleep reading it, which isn't because it was boring, it was just so mesmerising. And the waves it's literal waves. It comes in this style of ebb and flow, and waves come in like sets of 7 or whatever, and it feels like almost like that. She was sat at this window watching the sea coming in and out and the waves, and a mesmerising way of writing. Anyway, so it's interesting. The same module was Endgame, which is actually a play by Samuel Beckett. And so this became what I did you can't really call it an essay, but I did my submission on. Just a very strange play. Again, at first reading, I was like, the fuck is this? And I watched a performance of it online, and I still was like, the fuck is this? But again, you surrender yourself to the text, and you surrender yourself to the experience of watching and reading it, and it starts to kind of make sense, or at least not make sense, but you accept that it doesn't make sense, and you start taking your own sense from it. And by the end of it, I was kind of pretty much obsessed. So what I've not included in this list is like the academic books and the kind of books of academic essays and stuff, books like 20th century fiction. And I read several books all about Samuel Beckett's Endgame critiques and critical interpretations and stuff. What was really interesting, Beckett said that what's on the page is all there is, and if you don't take away the reference or whatever, that's not his problem. And everyone looks for, he said about the critics are welcome to lose themselves in footnotes and whatever, but they can provide their own aspirin. People can pore over his text and make of it what they will, but he's not bothered, which I thought was it's a very Beckett thing to say, but also you have to be very confident to say that, and I think it's something maybe we've lost a little bit. There's not many authors who do that, who say that. Again, I might speak about the piece that I submitted for that. It ended up being a stand-up style monologue with the ghost of James Joyce commenting in the style of Flann O'Brien, which has subsequently been turned into I've written it into a play. But anyway, we'll talk about that another time. But I recommend watching, just give yourself an hour to be weirded out, stick with it, watch it on your own. There's a really good adaptation with Michael Gambon and your man who plays somebody in Harry Potter. But it's a pretty old adaptation of it, but it's the best one that I saw. Yeah, very strange play indeed. Next up is Intimations by Zadie Smith, a collection of essays, one of which was recommended as part of the personal essay module. This was another book that I think unless you were already Zadie Smith, it wouldn't get published. In the nicest possible way. It's not that it wasn't good, it's just that you need to have that trust within you for a publisher to publish something like this. It's a collection of essays, kind of funny, kind of wry, kind of like insightful. I wouldn't say they weren't my favourite things that I read as part of that module. They felt a little bit obvious at times and a little bit perhaps slightly shallow in some places, which again is just crazy that I'm saying that about Zadie Smith, this multi-million selling author. And I'm like, oh, well, I would have done it differently. I don't mean it that way. They are good. I just preferred Sinead Gleeson. That's just personal preference. Whatever. Don't shoot me. It was short and you rattle through it. And again, I think it'd be quite a useful one to just pick up, read an essay and be like, yeah, that's good. Just to reassure yourself about what's possible. I don't know. I like that stuff. Next up, The Periodic Table by Primo Levi was another recommendation by my dissertation supervisor because the original concept for my dissertation revolved around a series of pieces that used the parts of the periodic table as like a jumping off point. It was originally going to be around diatomic elements. So these are elements that have to have at least two atoms in the molecule to be stable. And the whole idea is going to be this collective consciousness thing. There needs to be at least two people to make it exist. So it's going to be talking about relationships, but lots of different kinds of relationships. But anyway, that didn't end up that way. But I read it anyway. And again, hybrid, listen, read, really good. Just really good. Just really good writing. Really confident in a way that I think only an older person seems to be able to do. Is that true? Probably not, actually. But I felt like there was almost like a world weariness in the telling. He'd told his story so many times that this was all that was left. And these were just pictures from his life. They were so well told. I could have listened to 20 more of them. Yeah, really good. Next up, Dance Move by Wendy Erskine. This is another Blind Boy recommendation, actually. A collection of short stories. Again, really good. I wouldn't say all of them hit the mark for me. I think I wasn't always clear as to what was going on. Having just said, I quite like being unclear. So I don't mind letting that wash over me, but it sometimes felt like there was maybe just like a little something missing to kind of give me something to hold on to. I don't know. But generally, like each story had something really good with it, and the writing was really good, and the characterization was really good. And also just the way that she embodies a time and a place and a voice of people who are very ordinary in a way, but the stories are pretty extraordinary. There isn't the supernatural element of some of the other collections that I've talked about. There is very much a real world element, but not absurd. I don't read it as an absurd book, but the strangeness of the everyday world comes across. Yeah, that really nice collection. This is one I'm currently reading, actually. I've not finished it yet. Is Possession by A.S. Byatt. Never read any of hers before. It's told through letters and traditional narration. It's set in two different times, so it's relatively modern day, late 80s when it was written. Academics researching poets who are from the late 19th century, discovering a story about them. But it's about academic rivalry and possession, like physical possession or perhaps academic possession of discovery and of artifact, and then discovery of of personage and relationships and that kind of thing. Yeah, really good. Again, it includes like letters and traditional narration, so I like that. The writing is just really beautiful. I find some of it, because it's writing about these poets from the late 19th century, I do find that a little bit, it's written as them, and I find that that's a little bit dense for me. Or I'm too dense for it, I suppose, more accurate. It's not the kind of thing I would normally read, but it creates the characterization of those people. So their letters are very florid and full of all sorts of references that, go over my head. But again, I just let it flow over me. But yeah, enjoying that one. That was a recommendation, actually, or it came up in conversation during the Sacred Imaginations module, but I can't remember why, because it doesn't really have a religious element, but it came up in discussion. And so I took note of it, and then I found it at the book swap in the village, so it felt like fate that I should read it. And also the piece that I submitted for that module ended up being epistolary and what have you, so it has some relevance. Nearly done. Brief Interviews with Hideous Men by David Foster Wallace. Perhaps this is the only acceptable David Foster Wallace that a white man in his 20s or 30s can read. I think there's like a bit of an online discourse, or it's a meme, that straight white males all performatively read Infinite Jest, which is this massive book by David Foster Wallace. I've never read it, and I kind of almost was put off reading him because of that joke about people who read that book. But this was recommended by the tutor Zoe for the short story module, and again, I've not read all of them. He is, I suppose, a bit like Dave Eggers, and maybe they overlap in time in when they were writing this very sort of 90s cool, hip, slightly ironic style. I should say Dave Eggers really hates the fact that his writing is called ironic, because he does this big long definition of ironic, and it's not ironic, but it's this kind of slightly laconic style, I guess. A little bit too bored for it. So yeah, Zoe Lambert, the lecturer or tutor for the short stories module, recommended that I read it. I was, for whatever reason, the short stories I was writing, and yeah, they are good. I do enjoy his writing. There's a couple of the stories where he basically the footnotes get bigger and bigger and bigger and completely eclipse the actual story and become the story, which it's very clever and cool, but I don't know, it's a little bit too much like, okay, yeah, that's a cool trick. But well worth reading, very different. Each one is very different in style, so you don't get that repetition necessarily. What you do get repetition of is, here's some trick, or although the trick is different each time, but there is a trick or a stylistic thing that he's doing. So it's, again, not one to read in succession. So a lot of these I dip in and out of, so which is why I've not finished that and a couple of others. I keep different books in different places. So in the bag that I take out to uni or whatever, I'll have a couple of books. In my van, I'll have another book. In the front room, I have a book. In my bedroom, I have a different book. On audiobook, I have a different book. And it means that wherever I am, I can pick something up and just, if I've got a spare 10 minutes or whatever, I can read it. And I read a lot before I started the course, but what has obviously been evident is that there's a hell of a lot of reading involved, and not just a reading list. You should be reading everything that you can outside of that. So yeah, that's what I've been doing. Nearly done. 2 more. The last book actually in this list is The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, which was a Blind Boy Boat Club recommendation, but also cropped up in the reading list for the short stories module. It falls into the category of weird short stories. There's always something odd going on. It's another one that I've not finished. It's another one of my kind of emplaced books that I pick up wherever I am, which is good because I'm reading them non-consecutively. The weirdness is different every time, and it's different degrees of weirdness. It's nice to read a translated book because I feel like you get a different voice when it's written in a different language. That's a really obvious thing to say, isn't it? What I mean is you're not following the same strictures of European or British or North American writing. So even though the translation is good and it's hopefully accurate to what they've originally written, but also digestible as an English reader, it brings in a different set of emphasis and a different cadence and a different storytelling culture, which I think is important. Again, I don't always necessarily like a kind of show and reveal kind of haha story, but I would say what Mariana Enriquez does is she builds a really beautiful lyrical world around whatever then does happen, and so I can get on with that really well. I would say it's for me, they are stories not to be taken too frequently. I think this, Fen, Salt Slow. They're ones to be dipped into, is how it felt, and not to be just read in one go, personally. And then this final one it's not a book, but it's a magazine called Poetries in English. I signed up to the mailing list and submitted some. I'll talk about submissions and stuff in another episode, but I've been submitting some poetry and stuff to competitions just to force myself to do so, really. So I did that and signed up to the mailing list of Poetry in English, and basically pretty much every day or every couple of days I just get a load of poems in my inbox, and 2 or 3 poems, 5 poems maybe, different authors, different poems. I can read them in 10 minutes. And I would have never come across them before. Some of them are published authors, some of them, published poets, some of them aren't. And some of them I really like, some of them I'm not bothered for. But I'm reading them and I'm seeing them, and I think that's really cool. So I would recommend signing up for that. That's like a tiny little thing. And I suppose I've been, as a wider thing that's not listed here, is I've been trying to just consume more stuff. So reading more essays, more poetry, more online stuff. There's loads of Substacks out there. There's loads of other stuff out there. And following a load of stuff on Instagram and a load of journals and a load of magazines, and trying to consume all that stuff as well, just to try and show myself what's out there, I guess. Okay, this has been a really long episode, so it's going to be one of the longer ones, but it was a shorter one last week, in my defence. So it's going to take some editing. So there's nothing else really to talk about, I guess, in terms of this episode. I hope it's been interesting. I hope it's not just been one long list of books that you're never going to read. And there's loads of other books that I've not talked about that maybe I didn't read all of. For the fusions module, I was using James Joyce a lot, so I was reading the introduction to Ulysses, and then I was reading a biography of Samuel Beckett, but I didn't read it in a traditional way. I was using the indices to find relevant things and then cross-referencing and what have you, to build a biography of my own for my own purposes of the piece that I was writing. Loads of quite a few academic books on fiction or on essay writing. Andrew Dillon, Essayism, From Close-Ups to X-Rays was something else. Bending Genre is another one. The amount of reading that goes into this course is pretty amazing, but what I've liked is the fact that there's a reason to do it. And what I've had to get my head around is some days all I'll do is read, and to know that is as productive as a day of writing. It's not like working in an office where it's like I've got to have 2,000 words by such time. If all I do is sit there and look out the window or listen to an audiobook, then that's legitimate. And that is what I've had to do with a lot of this. So next week I will come back to one of my other pieces that I've been writing. So since I recorded the previous ones, I've done some work on the Princess Diana story, and had another meeting with my supervisor. So I'll be working on that based off the notes from that meeting. And like I said in the start of this episode, I've done a lot more writing on the Black Lane Ends piece on the farm, which I'm pretty pleased with. So I'll come back to that as well. I need to do some work on the A to Z I've not got around to. And then I need to, I need to write the critical reflection. I haven't got a fucking clue what I'm going to do with that about. But there we go. What we're going to do, huh? Okay. Thank you for listening. As ever, I find it hard to believe anybody is listening, and certainly listening this far. Good luck in all your future endeavours. Godspeed, and bye 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 bye.